Hey folks, welcome back once again. This week we are going to kind of take a look at some of the weirder effects you can in Photoshop. We've spent a lot of time talking about the standard retouching and non-destructive editing and this kind of stuff. Utilizing some of that information, I want to show you some of the more interesting features in Photoshop that you may or may not have seen in the past over the next couple weeks. So the first thing we're going to look at this week is the puppet warp feature. Now this is something that was added a few versions ago in Photoshop, and it's really kind of a neat tool. It's really fun to mess around with, but there actually are some pretty useful applications for it as well. So what I want to do is we have this image of a doll here, wooden doll. We are going to manipulate this wooden doll and put it in a different position. And this is just a random image that I chose. You could do this with a photograph of somebody jumping up in the air. There are just a few things that you need to keep in mind when you're working with the puppet warp feature. All right, the first thing that you need to do is to isolate whatever your subject is on its own layer. All right, right now we have this, it's a flat image, so the background and the shadow and the doll are all on the same layer. So what we want to do is get this doll on her own layer. So I'm going to grab the quick selection tool and draw a selection around the doll. You could either try inside the doll or on the background and then flipping it by doing select inverse. Just by dragging the quick selection tool around the doll, it's actually going to give me a pretty decent selection relatively quickly. All right, so just like that, I've gotten the selection that I want for the most part. It might be a few little things to clean up right here. So you can zoom in if you need to and clean up those little areas around the head. Whoops, got a little too much. That's pretty good for what I want to do. All right, so when you have that selection, make sure you have the doll and not the background selected. Just going to copy and paste. So you can go to Edit, Copy, shortcut is Command-C, and then Edit, Paste, Command-V. All right, so copy and paste. And you'll see your selection go away, your marching ants, and now we have, even though you didn't see anything change, if you get the Move tool, you'll see that we have this doll on its own layer. All right. So now that we've gotten this doll on its own layer, we want to get rid of the doll on the other layer, if that makes sense. So bear with me. So I'm actually going to hide this layer 1 that we just created. All right, and I'm going to select the background layer again, and I'm just going to make that selection again. If this was a real complex selection, we would probably save it, in channels like we did in a previous lesson. But in this case, I'm just going to drag my slider over, get that selection again. Now this time, because we're going to be manipulating the doll, I actually want to get rid of the shadow as well. All right, so I'm going to drag the quick selection slider over the shadow. It's probably going to get too much because there's not a whole lot of contrast. But we'll do what we can, and then I might hold down Option or Alt to subtract a little bit of this background. But just make sure, it doesn't have to be precise on the shadow. And if it takes away too much, then let go of Option or Alt and then paint back over it again till you get a pretty close selection. This is okay. This selection right here, where we have a little bit more than we need, but that's all right. Once I get this, I want to expand the selection just a little bit, just in case there are any pixels around the edges that we don't actually have selected. So with your marching ants looking like this, go up to the Select menu, down to Modify, and this is where you can contract, expand, add all sorts of different effects to your selection. I'm going to go to Expand, and 10 pixels is about all I need. So I'm going to leave it at 10 pixels and click OK. And you'll see your selection gets a little bit bigger just to kind of just to be sure that we have our entire image selected, what we want to get rid of. Now, this would take a while to use the clone stamp or the spot healing brush or all that kind of stuff. There's another healing tool that works really well in, I will say, 75% of situations. In this case, I think it'll work pretty well because it's a pretty random pattern in the background, so we're going to try it. I'm going to go up to the Edit menu and down to Fill. All right, Edit Fill, and for the contents, we want to select. We have foreground color, background color, and then down here, the second little section, we have Content Aware. And Content Aware is going to look at all these unselected pixels around our selection and do its best to fill in the blanks for the interior of the selection. So we're going to click OK, and Photoshop will do its thing. And just like that, I can deselect. That's a pretty good job that Content Aware Fill did. So that's all we need for that. Now comes the fun part. So we're going to bring back this our doll layer, all right, and select the doll layer. Now, Puppet Warp is actually a destructive method of editing, but there's a way around that. If you turn this layer, if you convert it into a smart object, then it becomes applied non-destructively, just like filters to a smart object. So what we want to do is convert this layer to a smart object by right-clicking on it. I'm going to convert to smart object. All right. You can also access that from this little menu up here in the top right corner. So now you see this little icon in the right corner. We know this is a smart object now. Now I'm going to go to the Edit menu and down to Puppet Warp. You might have seen this before. We were going to Free Transform and wondered what it is. So now I'll show you. And you know, it's odd that I actually have a puppet for the Puppet Warp. It doesn't have to be. It's just kind of what happened. All right. So now that we have this isolated on its own layer, it's a smart object. When you click Puppet Warp, you're going to get a thing that looks like a little push pin. And what we're going to do is click around on this object to make some, it's kind of like creating some points that we can either move or not move. So I'm going to click once at the top of the head, and then you'll see if I bring my cursor over that, I move it and the whole layer moves just like anything else. All right, so Command-Z to undo that. Now, if I click again here and I move, it's going to rotate. All right, so you'll see that first pin stays stationary, and you'll see it kind of stretch down if I want to do that, and the second pin moves around. If I click again, then those first two stay stationary, and the third one moves around. So you get the idea here. The idea is to create pins wherever you want to kind of keep something from moving, and then the one that you have selected will actually move. And now you can select multiple pins too by holding down Shift. And whichever one has the little white circle in the middle means it's active. So you can go back and forth and click from pin to pin to move them around. So whenever I'm working on a human-looking figure, you really just kind of want to think about it as the different joints that we have. So we have a neck. I'm going to click once on the shoulder joints, maybe the elbow, and then the hand. And you can start moving these around to see what happens. So now, if I do this, now you'll notice the bottom is moving a little bit because I don't have any pins down there to keep it steady. So I'm going to go down there and add a pin here, and maybe a pin down at the bottom, and then one final one down here. Now all these are going to stay steady. So now if I want to move just one point, I click on it and I can move it around. All right. If I want to move two, you can hold down Shift, and you'll see now there's two that have that white circle in the middle. So now both of those points are going to move like this. Now, so you can see how this can be pretty fun to mess around with. So I'm just going to kind of manipulate this figure, make it look a little different than it did. Kind of put our hands up in the air a little bit. And if it starts to distort, you can always click to add another pin and try and fix that distortion. The more pins you have, the more things you got to keep an eye on. But you want, the idea is to make this look like a realistic adjustment, not something that has been obviously photoshopped. I'm going to kick her head over to the side a little bit. But I want to keep that body basically the same shape. We'll move this over here just a bit. So you can kind of, mess around with this. Yours does not have to look exactly like mine. I just want to show you this is possible. You can start to imagine some of the things that you can do. So you could reposition people as they're jumping up in the air, or they're just standing there. There's a lot of different possibilities for using the Puppet Warp tool. So that looks pretty good. Whenever you get done, just like with a free transform, you can hit this checkbox up here at the top, and it will apply it. You'll see all of those little anchor points go away. And if you look over here in the layers panel, you'll see a smart filter has been applied, and it's the puppet warp. So now I can get my move tool, I can move this around just like any other layer. If I want to reposition something again, like if I see something that I'm not happy with, all I have to do is double click where it says puppet warp, and those pins come back up. Now this is the difference between having a smart layer or a smart object and not. If this was not a smart object, we couldn't go back in and adjust these things anymore. So that's why it's important to make it a smart object before you do it. And if we hadn't gotten rid of that shadow and that doll from the background layer, then we would see it now. So you always have to make sure you isolate this on its own layer and then get rid of all the original information on the first layer. So whenever you get it the way you want it, you can apply it. And then the last thing I want to do for this one is just add, replicate that drop shadow that was there already. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, the doll layer, all right? And now for some of the things that I want to do to this doll layer, I want to make it black and I want to blur it. I can't do that on a smart object. So this layer 1 copy that I just created, I need to rasterize it, which basically is the opposite of converting to a smart object. We want to take a smart object and turn it back into an image layer, pixel layer. So with that layer selected, you go up to the layer menu, down to rasterize, and you'll see smart object is just about the only thing that's not grayed out. So you click on that, and you'll see this turns into a regular layer. All right. Now, this is probably the most common, quick, easy way to make to replicate a shadow. Is I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. All right. Now, this is destructive. I could do this with an adjustment layer, but in this case, I don't need to because I know that I'm making a shadow. So I'm going to go Image, Adjustments, Levels, and this Output Levels slider down here, I'm going to click on the right and drag it all the way over to the left, and it basically takes all of the highlights, all the color out of that layer. All right, click OK. I'm going to drag this layer beneath the puppet, obviously, because I don't want the shadow to be in front, and move it. I want to try and replicate roughly the light source that we have, which you can see it's kind of like coming from upper left. So that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to blur this layer. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur. I'm going to use Gaussian Blur. All right, and that actually looks pretty good. About, anywhere between 8 and 10 pixels. You can kind of use your judgment there. Remembering sort of what that original shadow looked like. Click OK. Now obviously this is a little too pronounced, so I'm going to take the opacity down to about 25-30%, just to kind of, still give it a little sense of realism that figure is actually there. So we'll leave it about 25%. All right, there you go. So that's one way to use the puppet warp. The next video, we're going to look at how to use the puppet warp for other applications like typography.